Demonstrating drought resilience through land regeneration, coupled with the virtual fencing of livestock, is a project delivered by the South Australian NoTill Farmers Association, with funding support from the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund.
So I'm Megan Willis. I am a Senior Research Officer with SARDI, based down at the Struan Research Centre in the southeast. My role is leading a project looking at commercialising virtual fencing in livestock in South Australia. And as part of that, we've been lucky enough to collaborate with the South Australian NoTill Farmers Association, running a trial at Poochera on the Eyre Peninsula. Currently in South Australia, virtual fencing is prohibited under the Animal Welfare Act. So our main project within SARDI is to assess the wellbeing impacts associated with virtual fencing, as well as address some of the commercial applications of the technology within South Australia. And hopefully that information will help us to inform a change in the regulations that's currently being proposed by the regulatory body. So for our trials on the Eyre Peninsula, we were using the Gallagher eShepherd neckband. The product from eShepherd is a neckband that sits around the neck of the animal and speaks to a base station located on the property. The way that the technology works is a GPS-enabled virtual boundary is set in place using the associated software. And as the animal approaches that GPS boundary, the neckband will emit an audio tone. If the animal stops, backs away, turns around, nothing further will happen. And if the animal continues towards that virtual boundary, the neckband emits a pulse to the animal. And over time, it's been shown that through associative learning, the animals learn to respond predominantly to the audio tone alone, and they don't need to receive a pulse for the technology to be successful. So our trial on the Eyre Peninsula looked at containing a group of heifers behind a virtual boundary within a paddock, and we found that the technology was effective for that use. And in turn, that demonstrates that the technology can exclude animals from an area. So by containing those animals, we were also excluding them from a particular area within the paddock. So in terms of carbon management, we've demonstrated that virtual fencing could be a useful tool for excluding animals from areas such as native vegetation to allow regeneration, and allow carbon sequestration on properties, particularly extensive properties where fencing off large areas is impractical.
The Australian carbon market was established by the Carbon Farming Initiative Act in 2011. In 2014, this act was amended to include the Emission Reduction Fund and the Safeguard Mechanism. The amendments provide the framework for the method, measurement, verification, and issuance of carbon credits. An Australian carbon credit unit represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. Australian carbon credit units are a financial product under the Corporations Act and are a tradable commodity. Vegetation projects are the main type of carbon project in Australia, protecting forests and reforesting degraded landscapes, providing positive biodiversity, water quality and social outcomes. The government's Emissions Reduction Fund provides a means to secure long-term contracts for the sale of carbon credits. The human-induced regeneration method can be used by landholders who want to regenerate native vegetation on land where native forest is currently being suppressed. Projects under this method capture carbon by changing land management practices to facilitate regeneration of a native forest. To earn carbon credits, landholders can assist regeneration through activities such as managing the timing and extent of grazing. Human-induced regeneration works well when whole paddocks can be managed uniformly. The revenue from human-induced regeneration is on par with livestock grazing in this region, when a whole paddock can be uniformly managed. In some areas, like the Eyre Peninsula, there are very large paddocks, where human-induced regeneration is only applicable to a patchwork of land within the greater paddock. A 9,000-hectare grazing paddock, with a patchwork of degraded land that could be eligible for human-induced regeneration, was selected as an example paddock for a human-induced regeneration feasibility study. The feasibility study showed that up to 1,650 hectares of the 9,000-hectare paddock may be eligible for carbon farming under the human-induced regeneration method. restricting grazing across a whole paddock for a relatively small human-induced regeneration project is challenging for landholders. Physically fencing a patchwork of sub-areas within the paddock is also problematic. The project then tested the application of virtual fencing to allow access, or restrict access, of livestock to the designated areas within a paddock. To achieve this, a smaller trial paddock was established, and the virtual fencing trial was conducted under an animal ethics permit.
It was a 60-hectare paddock, and we excluded them from 15 hectares of that, and then the other ones that were just the trial mob, they were in a 45-hectare paddock, so they were both about the same size paddock. It worked really good. For the first week we had them just training, so you have the collars on them in a small, it was about a 6-hectare paddock, and they just all had to stay in that area, and they got to know that if they walked too close to the fence they'd get a beep, and then they would, if they touched the actual fence, which was where the virtual fence was as well, they would then get a zap, and then they'd walk away. But a lot of the technology works on the mob sort of effect. So if they're in a group and the first one goes near it and then turns, well, the rest of them just really follow anyway. The trial we ran was for 8 weeks, and for 7 of those weeks it was really, really good. And then when the feed levels got down, there was about 3 or 4 cows that didn't quite do the right thing, and we had to exclude them from the trial. To set up a virtual fence, I can do it on an iPad. I could push, set up a fence and just push 4 dots on the screen, and it'll just set it up. As long as it hasn't got really pointy corners on it that would trap the animals in the corner and they wouldn't know how to get out. It's got to be sort of 90 degrees or a little bit wider than 90, and it has a watering point in it, well then it will say, yep, you're good to go. And it can be as big or small as you want. I think you can't go under 3 hectares or something like that, but it tells you all that on there. And then once you've set that up, you just walk your cows into it and then tell the collars to keep them inside that area, and that's what it does. And if you want to do an exclusion one, you would do the opposite. Put the points and then say don't go in there. You can actually track where the cows have been, so that was one individual cow and where it walked over a 5-day period. All the yellow lines is where it had actually gone, and the white line on the corner up on that direction is the edge of the virtual fence, and you can see that one cow had been over the edge with those yellow triangles where the thing had an audio cue for it, but it's called a heat map, and so that gives you where the animals have been over a week or so you can see where they're grazing, where they're not grazing, and where they're included and where they live. So I was able to strap one of these things on the back of my motorbike and go for a ride around, check all the crops on their farm, and I found that out to about 10 kilometres from the base station, I could still track where I'd been everywhere. So if I had farms about, probably about 10 k's from one corner to the middle and then 10 k's to the other corner, and I'd be able to find my cows.
The acquisition of the virtual fencing technology is not without cost. However, the costs, including $6,000 for the GPS-based station and $350 per collar, seem reasonable for newly emerging technology. All participants in the project were very pleased with the installation and technical support offered by East Shepherd. Demonstrating drought resilience through land regeneration, coupled with the virtual fencing of livestock, is a project delivered by the South Australian NoTill Farmers Association, with funding support from the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. With special thanks, Simon Patterson for cooperation with Property and Livestock, the South Australian Research and Development Institute for support with animal ethics approval and cooperation with the Minnipa Field Day, East Shepherd for support of the virtual fencing component, and Australian Integrated Carbon for the in-kind provision of a detailed human-induced regeneration feasibility study.